Hello and welcome everybody to the Abide Project podcast slash lecture series. My name is Curtis Malifsta, and I have the pleasure of hosting this discussion between some CRC ministers, Reverend Aaron Vriesman, Eric Dirksen, and Aleah Marsden. And we are gathered here today to have a discussion about the future of the CRC. We were just discussing a little bit before we hit record about the nature of the CRC and where we're headed, and Aaron and Eric and Aleah have both written some really thoughtful articles about what that kind of looks like. What is the positive vision of the CRC? And so we wanted to have that discussion and maybe cast some vision and participate in probably discussions that are happening over coffee in the church fellowship halls or in living rooms around the continent. And so we just want to continue that discussion. So we're going to start with Aaron summarizing the article that he wrote in the Banner some months ago, and then we'll have a little bit of discussion about that. And then Eric and Aleah will summarize their article, and we'll have some discussion about that. And then the broader part of this podcast will be just kind of a free-flowing discussion after we kind of get everybody up to speed on these articles. So we'll kick it off to Aaron, and he can start with his.
Yeah, thanks, Curtis. My article was about a response to Synod 2024, and then trying to cast a vision for the future, trying to talk about who we are as a Christian Reformed Church, our identity as the Christian Reformed Church, and to try to have a positive discussion instead of what we're against. Let's talk about what we are for and what we are about and what binds us together. And the short version of it is that just my own survey of the Christian Reformed Church is that we have a lot of evangelical elements, and by evangelical I mean like the classic Billy Graham evangelical elements, not the modern political version of evangelical that has been politicized, but in an evangelical where there is emphasis on evangelism and prioritizing the gospel and willingness to work with other people who are also interested in those ends. So there's an evangelical element in the CRC, and then there's also the Reformed element of the CRC. And it seems like the evangelical wing of the CRC and the Reformed element of the CRC, they could come together and work together, and that they could complement one another really well. I think it's important to have reformed roots in our creeds and confessions and in the Reformed heritage. There's an excellent balance between God's sovereignty and human responsibility in the Reformed tradition. I like our three forms of unity, even over the Westminster standards. There's a lot more heartfelt doctrine in the three forms of unity. And so I think that the Reformed roots and an evangelical spin or emphasis of sorts would serve us really well, where we have an identity as a Reformed denomination, but we are not prioritizing the details. We are prioritizing the gospel and getting the gospel out there and serving God, building his kingdom, and working with people outside of our denomination to accomplish those ends. So some sort of blend of the Reformed and the more classic evangelical stream. I think that there's something there for the future of the CRC.
As I said before we started recording, so I'm just going to repeat myself here briefly for those that are already on the thing. We were really grateful to Aaron, and by the way of saying thank you to Curtis for the invitation to come on the podcast. Thank you for having us. We were really grateful to Aaron for kickstarting the conversation, or at least continuing and shoving it into another gear, because we shared many of those sentiments of it's definitely time to continue thinking about the identity of the CRC and who we've been and who we want to be and who we are going forward. So just by way of brief introduction, once again, thank you, Aaron. I think you did whether you intended to or not, I think you did a great service to the wider conversation and then to the denomination for saying let's start talking about who we are and who we want to be going forward. So kudos to you.
Thanks. Um, that was kind of the idea. Let's start here and see where it goes. So
Yeah. If I may ask, because it could have been easy just to write like here's what's gone on the past two or three synods. Here's what happened at Synod 2024. What was it? Was there something that you saw, or something that you've encountered, or was it personal? What made you add that second part to the article of saying, I want to talk about what's next?
yeah, that's a good question. I suppose that at Synod 2024, I kind of had the sense that we might be starting to put this controversy behind us. And if that is the case, we need to start talking about what is in front of us. So, I mean, there's still going to be some residual aftershocks of dealing with what we've been dealing with in the Christian Reformed Church for the past few years. So I don't want to assume that, it's all over and done with, um, but if this is going to be starting to be behind us, then let's start talking about what's in front of us and what that might look like. And let's at least start talking about it. Maybe, it's not going to be like one or two articles and then we're done. But I mean, as the CRC, we're going to have to come together as the CRC to forge this identity and what it means to go forward in the 21st century. Because the last time there was a huge jump in technology for communication, the Protestant Reformation happened. And now that the internet has taken over life in a very comprehensive way, the church is going to change again and be challenged in new ways. So I think that we're going to need to forge an identity, and what does that look like? So that was kind of the thought behind having a second half to that article. So
Yeah, I really appreciated the kind of vision casting that you were attempting to do there, that we can't just be about what we're against. And it's kind of terrifying to think that the only things that we can talk about are things of controversy as a denomination, but surely there are things that we can talk about toward unity, toward working together and moving together. Because the idea of continuing to have synod after synod that is just marked by the next thing that we're fighting about, that's not going to work for anybody.
indeed. And healthy denominations, or ones that are maybe healthy is the wrong word, but more stable denominations. They're talking about the discipleship that they're doing, the church planting that they're doing, the missions work that they're doing. That's what their synods, general assemblies are about. And I would like to get to the point where we're doing some necessary business, but we're also talking about what we're doing in our different corners of the world. And yeah, I would just like to get to the point where that's what our synods are about. How do we continue to do this and do it better?
Yeah. And I want to acknowledge that, I think it's been a body that's been through some trauma recently, right? And so there is a space for, there are hurting people. And people have been speaking from that place of hurt. And I don't want to minimize what we've gone through as like, well, let's just be done with it and move on. So I think trying to be in that tension, because we can't stay there either. We can't just stay in that space either. Like, but to hold that intention that we have been through something, and the idea, is that we actually maybe need some rest and some, just, kind of not, we don't have to just kind of keep jamming the gas pedal down, but to slow down a bit, to be patient, to be gentle, as Derek Bikema said, I think is going to be really important in this next season. I appreciated that in your article, that your tone, I felt that your tone was more gentle than some of what we've been reading kind of back and forth in, these online spaces.
Well, I appreciate that. I got slammed by a couple people for not having a gentle tone. So uh, I'm glad that at least some readers saw the attempt at gentleness anyway.
Well, I mean, if you're hurting, it's gonna be hard
Everything
to.
hurts.
Yep. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Um, well, why don't you guys talk about your article a little bit?
Sure, happy to. I think the impetus. Well, somebody asked me not that long ago, like, what was the reason for putting this out there? And I was like, well, the most present thing was there's this guy named Aaron Vriesman who wrote an article, and I read it, and it was very generative. And so I think it might have even been a Sunday afternoon, Aaron. So um, like a post-church shocking moment where somebody sent it to me, or somebody gave me an email, or something like that. And normally on a Sunday afternoon, evening, that is not something that I would touch.
Yeah.
Just watch football or something like that. But I think even just the link was captivating. I'm like, okay, somebody wants to talk about the future of the CRC. I'm game, and immediately found it generative. And so, as I said, I was grateful for it. I think we were both grateful for it. So we wrote a piece somewhat in response, but more of an addendum too, I think. And what we wanted to lean into was, so we definitely wanted to capture the sort of sense of a positive theological vision for the CRC. As Aleah said, not forgetting what we've been through or anything of the sort, but thinking deeply together about how we move forward, because you can't stay stuck. And the thing that came forward for us was, we want to see the CRC reclaim its birthright as a Reformed Catholic denomination. And that's not a phrase that we came up with. It certainly predates us. It's been used by some of our heavy hitters in the past. Bavinck uses it. Calvin uses it. There's all kinds of scholarly articles about the Catholic Calvin and things of that sort. So what we wanted to think about and talk about is the CRC cannot simply unify around belief. It never has, and it would be a failed attempt to do so. We think the CRC ought to unify around both belief and practice. And so to be Reformed is a way of being Catholic. It's a way of embodying the Catholic tradition. And by Catholic, of course, we mean small c, universal church. And so I think our vision was an alternative path for those who want a robust ecclesiology, those who want to pay strong and sincere attention to the sacraments, for those that want to lean into an ancient faith that is global and historic and traditional. You don't need to go to Rome, you don't need to go to Constantinople, and you don't need to be mainline. That there's a faithful way of being Christian Reformed that taps into, like, these are our roots and some of our best stuff. And so I think where I found myself nodding the most in agreement with your article, Aaron, was when you're like, let's take the best of our heritage and maybe stop putting it in a cupboard. And then we wanted to add to that and say the best of our heritage is not just the three forms of unity. It's also a series that somebody once referred to it as the CRC has a unique constellation of gifts, of agencies, of practices. We've thought deeply about worship. We've thought deeply about activism. We've thought deeply about the kingdom and covenant. And I think Aleah and I looked around and said, it would be a shame if the CRC just sort of dissipated into either a generic evangelicalism or attempted to kind of repristinate 16th century theology from the confessions and just to unify around those beliefs exclusively. And so it wasn't that we want to try to paper over them. It's that we want to hold them together with some of the things that we've done in the past. And so we want to reclaim some of the, like the CRC's done tremendous work on worship. And we look around and think that has gone by the wayside. That the going by the wayside predates 2016. Like, let's be honest about where the CRC has been with its worship and with its sacraments, frankly. So, I think we could take a look and say the CRC has had sort of a drift towards evangelicalism in its worship and in some of its theology, and maybe in other places it's been a drift towards the main line. Whether those are helpful categories or not, I'm not sure. But I suppose I would summarize our article as saying, let's reclaim our birthright, as to be Reformed is a way of being Catholic. And Aleah can jump in.
Wait, I was going to say, I think it's thinking through taking seriously our formation. That, if this kind of the Dutchness has been lost over time, that cultural, really strong cultural piece, what has replaced it is also going to form us, right? So if it's kind of generic evangelicalism that tends towards individualism, that tends toward consumerism, like we're being shaped by these forces, and we're seeing the fruit of being shaped by these forces as well. So thinking of kind of a comprehensive and holistic sense of formation that this is part, like Eric was saying, this is part of our heritage, that we have a robust doctrine, and that's important. Like that has to be built in there. But if we don't have a set of robust practice as well, then we're missing part of our own formation. That we're not, we're not just brains on a stick. That we need practices that are also going to help us embody what we believe and live toward unity together. And so I think it was kind of Eric and I's attempt to kind of raise our hand and say, hey, this is kind of how we're thinking about it. Like, anyone else out there want to keep talking? So.
Yeah. And after reading your article, and I found a lot that I agreed with in it. One of my questions, and I was hoping that you could maybe speak into this, each of you, both of you. Can you unpack Reformed Catholicity more? It was something that you mentioned quite a bit, and the article kind of fleshed it out, but I wasn't. At the end, I wasn't really sure if I got the essence of what Reformed Catholicity really meant. So I was wondering if you could talk about that a little more.
Yeah. And you're not the only one that's had that question.
Oh, okay.
So clearly we didn't state what we were hoping to, I suppose. And I'm happily willing to own that, or not happily necessarily, disappointed in us, I guess. But Reformed Catholicity, I think, is a way of somebody else. I'm not going to be able to give them credit. It might have been Allen and Swain in their book. They referred to it as a theological sensibility, not a system necessarily. And so it's a way of reclaiming the entire tradition of the history of the church, and not just sort of skipping over the first 14 or 1500 years of it, assuming that everything that was right has been, and obviously this is a gross caricature, of course. Okay, so, bear with me, but not just starting at the 16th century, and not even just starting at our own confessions and saying, well, we got it right and we're good, and let's move forward from there. But recognizing that the entire sweep of Christian history, if we take the Spirit to be active in history and the Spirit to be active in church, in the history of the body of Christ, then we do ourselves a real disservice. So some of it is a retrieval project in the same way that the Reformation was. Luther, Calvin, Melanchthon, the heavy hitters, all reclaiming the sources from the patristics. So there's a theological sensibility of reclaiming a particular theological sensibility that sees the sweep of history as ours and something to claim. It's also that Catholic motif comes in most distinctly, I think, in worship practices, in recognizing that you can't just take Reformed theology and plop it in any container. Like um, Al Walter's Creation Regained referred to, like there's a unity between form and content, right? And I think we worry that the CRC has for some time just assumed that you could be reformed and the manner in which you were reformed didn't matter. Um, the the content was what was important. I hate using the word, but the form didn't necessarily matter. And so then, like Aleah said, we also want to talk and think deeply about the ways in which people are formed and how that forms us. And so, even our own documents of the 1997 report on worship for the Synodical Committee, excuse me, had four motifs of what it meant to be, of like what we should be thinking about in our worship. It was, boy, I should know them off the top of my head now since I'm going to bring it up. It was biblical, Catholic, pastoral, which is sort of like contextual, and then confessional. And so for us, I think Reformed Catholicity is like, let's be Reformed, but as a way of being Catholic, as a way of being a participant in the entire sweep of Christian history. And so it's both us and it's connected to the entire church. And Leah, go ahead, give it a go.
No, that was great. Yeah, it's like I had said, kind of, it's that, I think it's the emphasis on sacraments that I think is also something that we start to lose with a generically evangelical drift. Why do we do the Lord's Supper? I think if you ask that, and you kind of mentioned in your article, Aaron, about like, could you ask someone like, what is the gospel? And that's kind of a loaded question depending on how you come at it. But like, why do we have the Lord's Supper? Could you ask someone that in your congregation and then have, a response for, I don't know, we do it like once a quarter or once a month or when we do it, or it's, are they going to give you that Jesus and me answer? It's my, my moment. And then we start getting into, some other spaces of like, how do we think about baptism? Because that's important with, I think that a Reformed Catholic understanding is actually the most comprehensive and coherent way that, we live out our CRC heritage.
Okay. Yeah, I really appreciated your and I did get this sense from the article that, the church wasn't born at 1517, that it goes a lot farther back. And I resonate with that because in theological discussion groups that I'm a part of, I find myself siding with Catholics against the mainstream evangelicals who are just kind of like me and my Bible kind of a thing. Hey, there's a whole heritage of the body of Christ that transcends time and space that we need to listen to and that we're a part of. And if we're not attached to that, then we're blown back and forth by every wind of teaching. So, anyways, I do appreciate that because the me and my Bible disconnected from the historic worldwide body of Christ is foolishness to me. And yeah, so I appreciated that about your article and definitely agreed with that part or that aspect of it.
Yeah, and that this isn't just Eric and I doing some weird thing out here on our own in California, but that this is, we've had synodical work done on this topic already. It really is a retrieval of, us saying, hey, it's in there. We've already talked about this, actually. There's some really good stuff that, could anyone else name those four things that Eric just named from that, from that committee's report? Does anyone even know they exist? Let's just, there we go. So it is, retrieval, not just of kind of the Church Catholic, but of our CRC. Like, it makes sense. And that's part of, I think, in our article, like, we were careful to say, hey, when we use Catholic, this isn't crazy out there language. This actually is our language.
Yeah. No, and actually, I have not read that report. So I'm going to dig it up and take a look at it because, yeah, I could not have told you what was in that report. So that sounds valuable. Um, yeah,
All is not lost.
what's that?
All is not lost. We got one.
Yes. Well, and another thing that I appreciated about what you wrote is an emphasis, or maybe not an emphasis, but a value of sacraments.
Yeah.
That the Reformed tradition has a high view of sacraments. We are not Baptists, and the baptism and the Lord's Supper are not glorified sermon illustrations that are just symbolic. These are actual means of grace that God communicates himself to us in ways that go beyond our understanding.
Yes.
And I think that needs to be that needs to be emphasized and taught, for sure. Um,
And that's one of my worries. I think what's unique about our context is we're in Northern California, and so we have very few people that have any sort of history with the CRC in particular, or even Reformed theology in general. Many come in and find it a breath of fresh air. I can't tell you the number of like students and grad students that come from either a fundamentalist or sort of a Baptistic perspective, and they'll say things over the years like, well, I'm just an engineer, and I want to know how I also can serve the kingdom of God. I'm like, well, let me tell you about this beautiful thing called Reformed theology. But one of the biggest switches for them to flip, and this is not like young people, this is like families that come through. They'll get liturgy, and we take communion weekly, and they're like, I'm into that. This makes sense. And they'll get formative practices, and they're like, I love that. And they'll appreciate the children's ministry is connected to the liturgical calendar and with the rest of the life of the church. They're like on board with all of it. But that baptism question is one of the biggest ones. And they'll be like, I just can't, I don't know that I can make that switch. And so having that as part of our context, it does in fact concern me that I heard at least the last 2 years on the floor of Synod, a willingness to sort of paper that over so that we could get to the place where people wanted to be on sexuality. Do you know what I mean? Like, almost like a wink and a nod, like, hey, the Gravamen thing is let's just be honest, we're all talking about making sure that we right the ship when it comes to human sexuality, and the other stuff isn't really necessarily that important. I've even had people ask, like, why not just partner with Reformed Baptists more? Like, we're so close. And by partner, they don't mean like in an ecumenical relationship. They mean, why don't we welcome more Reformed Baptist pastors into the fold? And like, it's not that big a deal, right? Like, they love Calvin, so they don't want to baptize babies. Like, what's the big deal? For me, it's a huge deal. And because like, we have a unique constellation and we have a unique understanding of the sacraments, and we do take them very seriously, Aaron. So for me, one of the reasons to write the article was of concern that we would just sort of, slide in that direction. I don't mean that quite so negatively, but like, if we're Reformed Baptist, if the future of the CRC is Reformed Baptist, that already exists, and that we don't need to be here. Like, go ahead and go do that. But a robust understanding of the sacraments and practice of it, we're here for that.
yeah, for sure. And our sacraments do take up significant portions of our confessions. And if we are going to be confessional, I mean, sacraments are a huge part of that. Um, and as somebody who has baptized a baby of a couple, and then a few months later, seeing them being rebaptized themselves at a different evangelical church. I am more and more starting to detest the error of the Anabaptists, and I that I know that's not a popular part of the confessions, but I'm starting to feel that because you know how how dare you violate that that sacrament that way and treat it as something that is just individualistic, something that's non-covenantal, something that is uh, purely self-expression, not God ordained, God initiated. So, anyways, that's
And I don't
my
think,
little soapbox.
no, and I don't think you can drop that theology into just any box, right? Into any form, because if you're trying to teach that in a worship space that is individualistic, that is about self-expression, it's not going to form people in the same way, right? Like that's if there's going to be a disconnect there. And I think we're living in some of that disconnect space in the CRC where it's like we need that more comprehensive formation to happen so that it all is working, it's working together.
Yeah, I don't know if you would agree with this or not, but from my observation, it seems like the CRC is made up of people who read different different sources external to the CRC.
Hmm.
So you have a mainline group that reads progressive sources, you have a confessional group that reads Presbyterian sources, and you have an evangelical group that reads broadly evangelical sources. And then those are all brought in, and then we have all of these conflicts because we're not reading the same stuff, and we're not valuing the same stuff. Um, and so I think in the past, the people in the CRC have read CRC authors where there's been there's been a unique identity to it. Um, but it it seems like a lot of CRC people now are reading outside the CRC, and those and those other influences are coming in.
Yeah.
And
Although I
so
love being part of a denomination that people are reading, apparently.
maybe
I love
reading
that
is,
idea.
yeah. Um, but but yeah, we're not coalescing. We're in factions, and somehow that has to come together. Um, I don't know if you would agree with that or not, but that's just kind of been my observation.
I think that's right. Um, I don't think we fully reckoned with like something. It's not simple, but we didn't have the money, and there was a whole host of reasons, and so we sort of stripped Faith Alive of its both its mandate and its money. And I know that I have conservative friends that were like cheering that on. They're like, yeah, it's because they just produced liberal stuff, and um, I don't necessarily think that's entirely true. But for example, I think I wonder and I worry how many churches have a Sunday school curriculum, have a children's ministry curriculum that's written by Baptists. And just to be clear to everybody listening, love the Baptists, okay? God bless you. If you're a Baptist, we love you. Um, but I think we're naive if we assume that we can teach our children from a perspective that is saying one thing while trying to embody a different thing. And so getting back to Aleah's comment about you can't just like plop that into different forms. Um, and so here we want to emphasize baptism in our children's ministry curriculum as often as we get a chance. And we want kids to be thinking about their baptism. And if we have not given them a chance to be reminded of their baptism weekly, then we have failed. And you can't just have a generic like, even if you had the most generic children's ministry curriculum, well, then I already object because it doesn't mention baptism. And it just shoves it to the side as if it's not important. And like, well, you're going to get that in a sort of a broadly evangelical thing because often, evangelicals don't necessarily know what to do with the sacraments. So, um, like, that's a problem for me. And I've lost my train of thought after that. But, oh, in terms of like reading other sources, yes, uh, I think that's right, Aaron. So like Faith Alive is a thing. I think we don't. I think we have not fully reckoned with what it meant that we no longer mandated liturgical forms. Again, I would be worried, and I wonder how many Christian Reformed churches really don't pay them any attention. We recommend them for worship, which is great. I was in Grand Rapids in 2016 during Synod, and I wasn't a delegate. I was at a side conference somewhere else, and I was aware of the conversation that was happening around updated liturgical forms in 2016, and was shocked and scandalized and disappointed at how little conversation they got on the floor of Synod because everybody was looking forward to like this next fight that we're about to have. And I think that's to our detriment. Um, you ask like sources and things like that. There's a guy at our church that started attending about a year ago, and he met his wife, Aleah. Where did they meet? Tarek. Hi, Tarek.
Lebanon.
Yeah, fine. Oh, thank you. Thank you. So they met in Lebanon. He's Lebanese, and he attended an Anglican church in Lebanon. He didn't grow up Anglican, but he attended an Anglican church in Lebanon. And then they moved to the States and they moved to Georgia. And they attended an Anglican church in Georgia. And I asked him not that long ago, I'm like, talk to me about the two churches, like what was different, what was similar, and why did you choose each of them? And they're with us at Christ Church. And full disclosure, we often get accused of being Anglican adjacent. So I'm telling a story that betrays that, I suppose. So this Lebanese guy who's now in Northern California tells me that one of the things that they love about the Anglican tradition is that they could go to pretty much any Anglican church and it's going to be very similar in the form. And I was listening to him and lamenting that for years I have been haunted by the notion that somebody that comes to Christ Church and then is about to move, I couldn't just say, go to any Christian Reformed church because it's going to look like what you appreciate here. And I'm not talking about the theological presuppositions underneath. I'm talking about I have no idea what you're going to get when you go to congregation X, Y, or Z. Diversity is lovely and it's wonderful, and yet maybe we're missing something. And so not only are we not reading the same sources, we don't have the same practices, which kind of gets back to the point of our article, I suppose. But sorry, long tangent.
Yeah. No, practices are certainly formative, and I think that your article really does a good job of highlighting that. Form and content go together, and so there's a reason why we practice things the way they do. And lots of people who would be Calvinistic in soteriology are not reformed in a lot of other ways, ecclesiologically or in the sacraments or other things. Um, yeah, you can't just pull those apart. Um, Practices are formative, and I think that there's something right about that. Um, Looking at other Christian traditions, it seems like everybody unites around something. So the Anglicans, their belief is essentially doctrine divides, liturgy unites. And so we're going to have the same. So their big fights are sexuality, but Book of Common Prayer and what the wording is there and everything. And Lutherans and Reformed and Presbyterian were kind of reunited around our beliefs and that sort of thing. Um, uh, Catholics, Roman Catholics they're united around their structure, the bishops and that hierarchy going all the way back to the apostles, and same with the Eastern Orthodox. Um, the churches that I know of that emphasize not only one thing but the other are usually the most fundamentalist, most strict of the churches that are out there. Um, they are they are the ones that are inflexible on lots of things, not just doctrine or practice. I'm wondering I'm wondering if we are a church that is solid on doctrine and has codes of worship and practice. Are we going to become? I don't mean uh, fundamentalist is maybe the wrong word, but very strict in our orientation. Are we going to be overcome by the details all the time? I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
I think it was Thomas Merton I was reading recently, writing on prayer. And he talked about, a healthy body is one that is flexible and pliable and not rigid. So I think the hope is that in health, it's not this, excuse me, this kind of continuing purity spiral that gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And so that what unites us is, these really, really strong borders. But, you know, what can we graciously rally around? What I don't want to come across is like this has to be contextual. It can't just be, picking up Christ Church and stamping it across the denomination. Like we're not Anglicans. Like that's not what it's going to look like. But I think there are best practices, and I think we've lost the sight of what those best practices can be to orient towards. You said in other places, but I get to do pulpit supply for a number of churches kind of in our area, and it's different church to church, and which is fine because of the contexts are different church to church. But I don't want to go into a CRC church and see the communion table behind the drum set because they're not doing communion that week. Like, because that's a formative piece of your worship space. And so there's pieces like that where it's how can we graciously contextualize best practices and without becoming that rigid, like, oh, you've stepped out of line. Like what I don't want is like, we love these liturgical forms and we love, the lectionary and we love the church calendar and we're going to police it, because I don't think we need thought police around belief and action police. Like we're missing it then. How do we orient ourselves to be moving together in ways that are gracious and thoughtful?
Yeah. I think we recognize that the CRC for some time has been in a low trust environment. And I'm occasionally reminded of this. And so one aspect of pushback that we got not that long ago was a pastor saying to us, I kind of like the vision that you've laid out here. And I like maybe even a little bit more uniformity around worship practices without being completely, uniform. But for my people, they're going to be skeptical of anything that looks like this. And it's not because it looks Catholic. They're going to be skeptical because the only liturgical churches they know are progressive. And therefore, they're going to wonder if liturgy is a Trojan horse for mainline liberalism. And I was really taken aback by that comment. And then I guess I understood it because I knew his context a little bit more. So we recognize, and I think probably everybody on this podcast recognizes that the CRC has been in a low trust environment for some time. And so the temptation in a low trust environment is to constantly tighten the screws so that like we once again feel safe. And yeah, I worry that we continue to tighten so much so that there's nothing left, which is again not a Trojan horse to say that anything goes. But I want us to think about a whole host of things, including our worship practices. Not
Well,
only
then
will
we
and go ahead.
no, and then we do have the confessions, right? Like we do have these guardrails that we have the edges of the canvas that we get to create, within that space. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just my background, I was homeschooled kindergarten through 12th grade. And in being homeschooled, we had a homeschool group, and we did lots of outings and field trips and sports together and everything like that. And it was quite an eclectic group of people. We had people from the holiness tradition, we had Pentecostals, we had independents, we had some Catholics there. Um, and we all got along really well. Um, we all kind of had a common vision for educating the kids in a distinctly Christian sort of way. And so and so when I think of evangelical, I think of I think of something like that, where we're willing to work with people that have a similar understanding of the gospel. We're able to get together with them. We don't feel threatened by them. We know where we stand, but we're able to do things together. Um, and 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 so in I noticed that in your article, if we disagree, and maybe it's mostly just terminology on the word evangelical, which has been politicized in to no end here, which creates more problems, and so maybe there needs to be a different word for it. Um, but uh, but yeah, the individualism, the independence, and the congregationalism, and at one point you say trite sentimentality of evangelicalism, and I think that there's something to that, where those things annoy me about evangelicalism too. Um, but but what I found is that when you are together with people from different traditions, it's the gospel that unites you. When I took a year at community college, and there was a Christian group there, and we had Catholics and evangelical free and myself, and we bonded, because it's like, hey, we can talk about God here, and that's okay. Um, and and then I got to Calvin College, and then the debates were on the details, you know. So there's something about having interactions with people with Christians of other traditions that kind of focus us on the essentials of the gospel and evangelism and basic Christian service, um, that that I think would be important for us in the Christian Reformed Church, to keep us from becoming bogged down in the details and arguing the details. Um, that was what was in my mind, anyways. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think if even in the first read, Aaron, of your article, I remember thinking to myself, I'm pretty sure I know what he means by using the word evangelical. And you do spell it out. You mentioned evangelism and I think like activism or something along those lines. Um, but my aversion to the word, and again, love our evangelical brothers and sisters, everybody. So don't pin me to the wall. Um, my aversion to the word evangelical is probably also largely contextual. Um, so if the goal is like, let's work across lines with people that we can agree with, sort of the basics of Christianity, I'd probably call that ecumenical. Um, because yeah, I do worry that the word evangelical has been just sort of so colonized as to almost be useless. When we have, in the United States, when we have people who identify as evangelical but never go to church,
Hmm.
it becomes a political marker. And that's not just maybe that's a media created thing. I don't know. It's sort of beside the point. But if by evangelical you primarily have that sort of strain of the CRC, which has always been there, that sort of pietist strain of the study of scripture and the importance of the gospel and a certain evangelism strain, obviously I'm all for it, and I don't think we would quibble in any way about that. But my concern would have been with, yeah, has that word evangelical just been so co-opted as to immediately send people down rabbit trails that it's almost impossible for them to get back from. And I recognize you could say the same thing about Reformed. I mean, for 15 years, I've been saying to people, listen, you're going to go online and you're going to read some stuff about Reformed theology. That's not necessarily what it means in the CRC. Um, and that kind of gets me back, I suppose, to the point of our article. And I think what you were saying in the other part of yours is like, let's be the Christian Reformed version of Reformed. Let's be the, like, not ethnic, but let's be the Dutch version of Reformed because that's different than the Presbyterian version. It's different than the Scottish version. It's different than the English version of Reformed. Um, let's lean into our own things a little bit. So yeah, my concern was primarily the word evangelical. And like I said, I think I know what you meant, and even hearing you say it, now, um, I still worry that there's an assumption that we could take Reformed theology and kind of plop it into evangelical containers, and I'm not sure that that's true. Um, Even going back to things like worship and like thinking deeply about the songs that we sing and the manner in which we sing them. Um, I assume that everybody on this call, we're not naive. Like the people in our churches are going to remember the song that they sang on Wednesday much more than they're going to remember a line from any of our sermons. And I think one of the things like we should be thinking deeply in the CRC about the kinds of songs that we sing and where do they come from. And if it's sort of a generic evangelicalism, there might be touch points that are good, but there also might be things that are forming them in ways that are sort of counter our own tradition.
Yeah, I think I read it also. Listening to you talk about it, Aaron, makes me think more of kind of an ecumenical, more than I would think evangelical. I appreciate the heart for wanting to work with others outside the CRC. I think maybe in our context here, that's such a given that that could almost be a blind spot, right? Like the closest CRC church to us is 20 miles away. There's not another Christian Reformed church in Davis for us to kind of like huddle up and partner with. Our Central California classis is a really large geographic area. We couldn't have a Wednesday coffee, catch up. I think Zealand has something like that, right? I think I
Yeah,
remember.
we do.
Yeah, that's not possible in kind
Hmm.
of our context. So I think, working with other churches and other traditions here in Davis, I can speak for our church at least, the ministries that we participate with and caring for those experiencing homelessness, like they have to be more ecumenical because that's what our options are. So if I'm hearing you with that, I'm like, oh, yeah, we do. That makes sense to me. Absolutely.
Yeah. I think the thing that I resonated the most with, Aaron, was a call to evangelism. And that was how one of the ways that you were using evangelical, if I remember correctly. And you even said here sort of the classic Billy Graham kind of thing. And there again, I would be like, yeah, let's be Christian Reformed evangelists, and let's be sacramental Christian Reformed evangelists. Our weekly altar call, I'm stealing this from somebody else, but like our weekly altar call is the call to the table. And um, you don't have to have you don't have to have a Baptistic sort of, come get rebaptized because you're rededicating your life to Christ. Instead, you get to have we practice communion weekly. And so instead, we get to invite people to consider what has kept them from the promises of God to them in baptism, or what's keeping them from this table of reconciliation on this particular day. And my kids mock me because, I just parroted back things that we say almost weekly in our liturgy. And, I think it's fair to say that the CRC hasn't had a tremendous history in evangelism, and our history in church planting is checkered. And I think we've also had a habit of just sort of chasing whatever was pragmatic and whatever seemed to be working in the moment. And to be honest, people have accused us of the same thing, like, oh, well, liturgy's cool, so way to go. People are into that now. I'm like, listen, if we get 100 people on a Sunday, that's a good day. We're not riding some wave of enthusiasm for liturgy and the sacraments. Like, if that was true, I would be ecstatic. But I would say that we value liturgy and formation not because it's currently practically in, but because it's faithful. And it doesn't matter whether it goes in vogue or out of vogue. The problem with chasing vibes is eventually they change. And so if people are in the moment interested in ancient forms of spirituality, that's great. But I recognize that trends change quickly as well. So I would love the CRC to be thinking deeply and having robust synodical conversations and classical conversations, because it's probably going to happen at the classical level much more than it's going to happen at the synodical level. Let's think deeply about our context, and let's think deeply about evangelism, and what does it mean that, people's first interaction with Christianity is probably going to be online? And what does it mean that we're a people of the book, but we're entering into a post-literate age? I tend to think that a Reformed Catholic spirituality that emphasizes liturgy is a gift to us in this moment, but I digress. I don't want to get on the hobby horse too much.
Well, I would be interested to know, you talk about reclaiming the old CRC, that sort of thing. Historically, and even in Geneva, Lord's Supper was not practiced weekly. So
Much to
that
Calvin's chagrin.
yes, agreed. But that wouldn't that be an innovation?
Yeah. Yeah. For most people in the CRC, it would. And so I would reemphasize that I think a Reformed Catholic approach is retrieval, not repristination. And so I'm not interested in going back to the Christian Reformed Church of my grandparents. I think there is room for innovation and there is room to move forward. And we have this in our bones as well, that the 1968 report on worship and the 1997 report on worship are both really, really excellent. And weekly, so I'm not saying that we should go back to the CRC that was. I think the tone and tenor of our article is similar to yours. Let's faithfully embody the best of our traditions in our contexts now. And I would argue that faithfully embodying a Reformed sacramentology would be weekly communion, as Calvin wanted, but as the elders at Geneva said no. I don't think there's any good theological or biblical reason to not take the sacrament weekly. I think there's only pragmatic and practical reasons, and traditionalism as opposed to tradition. But again, if the CRC wanted to fight about having weekly communion, I think we're here for that conversation. Let's go ahead. Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about these things, and absolutely. But yeah, I cop to it. It would be an innovation. And so there are elements of our liturgy that are probably even more formal than the liturgy that I grew up with. Um, but I don't know. I would assume, and all three of you can correct me if I'm wrong here, if this is an assumption that's wrong. I wonder how many Christian Reformed congregations are even following the sort of most basic fourfold structure of worship: gather, word, table, sending. Um, how many, like, I confess, we're way out here. And I've only got, I've got friends in a number of locations, and so I kind of know what they're doing. But my sense is that it's true the average Christian Reformed person would probably wonder about taking communion weekly because it would feel Catholic to them. But I think it's true that the average Christian Reformed member would also be scandalized at how important Calvin thought the sacraments were and how robust our ecclesiology is. And I think, so again, one of my aversions to the word evangelical is I think by and large, we're so evangelical that we don't even have a sense of how robust our own understanding of the sacraments actually is. Like, as Aleah said, they're in the confessions and they speak very heartily of them. But then go ahead and read Calvin and read the Institutes and read what he does think of the church and read what he does think about, and not just the Institutes for that matter. But anyway, so I think, yeah, it's an innovation. Um, I don't know, Aleah, do you have anything you want to say about that?
Um, it's innovation, but not innovation for innovation's sake, right? Where it's rooted is different. If you have innovation that's just kind of like innovation because we want to be seeker sensitive, innovation because we want to um, draw upon the cultural, the TED talk, or we want to bring people in with our, slick high production, um, service. That's a different kind of innovation because it has a different rootedness. It has a different, actually, I don't want to say that. I don't know if it has a different telos or not, but I think the innovation we're talking about is one that it's an innovation that's rooted before the Reformation, right? It's rooted in that Catholic sense of the church. So I think to me that's a different kind of innovation because it's anchored to a different place.
Right. We're actually getting back to the roots by having more regular communion and Lord's Supper observance, um, than to do it the 4 times a year or whatever the standard is. Our church does it 5 times a year, and yeah, for mostly pragmatic reasons, like you said. Um, yeah. So, um, I can get your hesitation with the word evangelical, and I had some pushback from people in my circles on that too. Uh, one guy said I really cringed when you use that word evangelical, and probably because it's a loaded word and it's kind of, as was said already, it's lost its meaning. Um, so maybe it's better to drop it, um, and talk about it in different ways, um, because yeah, that would get lost. Um, what about the concern that a high view of the sacraments would would let's see, the churches that I've been to, um, it seems like one or the other is central, word or sacrament. Either the table is in the center or the pulpit is in the center. How would you respond to people who are concerned that, okay, if we put the table in the center, the word is going to get off to the side and it's not going to be a word centered worship anymore? How would you respond to that?
I think that that's part of the formation that needs to happen is that word leads into the table every week, just to share a little glimpse into kind of me and Eric's ministry life here. If Eric's preaching, I'm usually doing the table. If I'm preaching, Eric's usually doing the table. And part of the gift of that for me has been I listen to Eric preach through a lens of thinking of how I'm going to transition to the table, right? I don't have his manuscript beforehand. But I'm learning then it's forming me to pay attention to like the table. The sacraments are present. They should be present in a proclamation of the gospel. So that when I come to the table, it's tying it all, it goes back and forth. The sermon should reference the sacraments reference the word. Like that should hopefully be something that we're doing well so that it's not one elevated above the other. Personally, coming into ministry in this space as a new kind of seminary student and grad, part of what I really resonated with was coming in and feeling like the sermon, the word, got decentralized a little bit because I feel like there had been in a lot of contexts I'd been in where like the sermon's the big show, right? We're all here to be fed on the word. And like, yes, and I think we lose the sacraments, almost completely in a one that's so sermon focused. For me, decentralizing the sermon just enough that we actually have the sacraments along with the sermon made me feel like, oh, as a pastor, this is the piece I get to bring to the worship space. And it's not about me, and I'm not the center of it, me bringing the word as far as like, this is the big show that you're all here for. This is the piece that this is me getting to proclaim the gospel. And we are going to embody that and live that out as we're fed by means of grace. So I actually think that I understand the hesitation and the concern there, but I think we've swung so far in the other direction that like there's room for some correction.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say the same. I think, and again, I want to be careful speaking for the average CRC because there really is no such thing, right? But if we don't have a robust picture of the sacraments as baptism and the Eucharist or communion, I mean, I think the operative sacrament in the CRC for a while has been the sermon. Like that's the primary means of grace, and the others are just sort of. I think it was your. I tried to write it down and I missed it, Aaron, but I wanted to steal it. Like the sacraments are just. What did you call them?
Glorified sermon illustrations.
Yes, thank you. Glorified sermon illustrations. Which would be like that's a scandal to think of them like that, but that probably is the operative theology in many CRC circles, and I think we need to avoid that as a damnable practice, as our friend John Calvin might call it. And so, yeah, I'm also in tune with decentering the sermon, not the word, and I would say that. Especially early on, I would get accused of often by people who are tourists to our liturgy and to our services. They would be like, or they'd never been. They would have questions around, well, how can you take the word seriously if you are practicing communion every week, and can a 20 to 25-minute sermon really accomplish anything? We need like, in a post-literate age, and when people aren't biblically literate, you need like 40 minutes and you got to go and you got to teach. And I'm like, well, I think about the sermon differently than you do. I don't think it's primarily teaching and didactic. It's got an element of that, but it's primarily proclamation. But then B, I'll put up a liturgical service. Like, go ahead and find how many different scripture references are throughout our liturgy, or, I think a higher liturgical service. The word is at work all through it. And so the word ought to be at work in the call to worship. The word ought to be at work in a call to and in the prayer of confession. It ought to be at work in the assurance of pardon. We ought to be singing scripture. And so I think liturgy and the liturgical calendar are the preacher's best friend. That they are an opportunity to get people into the word that aren't reading it anyway. So this kind of goes back to my, concern about we're a post-literate age. But so yeah, I think like decentering the sermon a little bit is probably an okay thing. And recognizing that the sacraments themselves are extensions of the word, they're not glorified sermon illustrations. So I'm not particularly worried in that, about that. I think there are other ways. I think the question about how to continue to catechize people is a live one. And I'm not convinced the sermon is the primary seat of catechesis and formation. I think the worship service writ large is. Which I don't mean to devalue the sermon, but contextualize it and put it in its proper place in the larger warp and woof of the entire service. It's not just like 4 songs and then we really get to the point of the service with the long sermon, 1 song and done. Like that's a liturgy, but I think it's a severely deficient one.
Yeah. Yeah. When I was in seminary, I'm more, let's say I'm on the, for lack of a better word, conservative side of the CRC. And so I decided to go to the seminary of the RCA for a variety of reasons. But one of them is
Can we talk about that, Aaron? I definitely want to hear more about that.
Okay. Well, one of the reasons, there were multiple reasons, but one of them is that I wanted to get challenged in what I think, where I stand and all of that. And then I did an internship at a church that was kind of a Willow Creek model church. And so my formative time in ministry was, okay, we are very strict on our liturgy and we have all of these elements in there, but same-sex marriage, let's talk about it. We can debate that. And other things. You can be a 4-point Calvinist or a 1-point Calvinist if you want to. That was my seminary setting. And then I went to this church where I served, and theology was important and our values were important. But hey, let's just get together. Let's like you said, let's sing some songs. Let's hear from the word and that sort of thing. And I was drawn to that more than the maybe call it mainline emphasis on the worship, de-emphasis on the beliefs and the theology. And so that might be part of where my attraction to quote unquote evangelicalism also comes from. At the same time, loving the confessions, there's a high view of sacraments there, and even just from a pragmatic standpoint, what you both have mentioned is that form and content go together. So I think that you definitely have an argument there, and I would be interested in talking about that more, or thinking about that more, the form and the content, and can you put a reformed theology in an evangelical liturgy, and maybe you can't, and that seems to be your argument, and I would be open to that argument. I'd be interested in talking about it. Would you argue for or advocate for more psalm singing? You talked about how the word is meant to inform the whole worship service, and classic CRC. If you go way back, it was no, we got to sing the psalms. That's important. Would you advocate for that, or?
Not exclusively, but more. Yeah. 100%. Yeah.
Okay.
Certainly an intentionality in song selection, and not just this is what we're hearing on the Christian radio, and people really feel the vibes of this song and feels good. But to really look at what what we're singing and how we're singing it, to pay attention to those pieces.
Okay.
And that we're singing it. Like I think that's where the form and the content goes. Like the average song on whatever your local Christian radio was not written for a worship context. It was written for a performance context. And so you can't, like, just forget the content. You can't take that form, drop it into a Sunday service, and expect that people are going to be able to robustly sing that. You might have like 5 people that could really belt it out, but for the rest that aren't necessarily musically gifted, you are leaving them just high and dry. And there have been a number of like worship studies and demon projects and stuff like this on how few people are singing in large worship spaces, depending on the music choice. And here again, the CRC has a history of a Psalter hymnal and 4-part harmonies, which are not exclusively psalms, but they do care deeply about congregational singing. And that's something else I think the CRC should be thinking about. And again, reclaiming our heritage of a robust philosophy of worship. So yeah, I think we should be singing the Psalms. I think we should be singing the doxology. I think we should be singing the Gloria Patra. I think we should sing the Sanctus. I think this might be a scandal to say, but I think it is a scandal, actually, that we have given so little thought to the people that are leading worship in our congregations. If they're not A, theologically trained, or B, given direction from pastors and clergy, then those people have a more direct, I think, those people have as much, if not more, of a direct impact on our people's formation than we do. If we're outsourcing all the worship planning to a worship planner who A, hasn't been theologically trained, or B, is just sort of picking songs from whatever Christian radio station that they're getting them from, then yeah, form and content are not going to go together. And we should not be surprised if our people are catechized more towards a generic evangelicalism that might be more Baptistic and individualistic and consumeristic in leaning than anything that they're going to find in the confessions. And eventually we're going to reap the benefits, and probably already are, that our confessions are going to rub up against the way that people are being actually formed.
And that the music, our song selection makes sense over the flow of the liturgy in the service. It's not just choosing like the right worship song to come on as the pastor's finishing preaching, that really emotionally drives it home, but that the song selection makes sense around our prayer of confession, that, after being assured of your pardon, that like that song makes sense in that place within the liturgy. That's formative. That's formation.
Yeah.
This has been really wonderful. I love what I'm hearing, but I wonder, as we wrap up, if maybe we could just go around in light of the conversation, and just thinking about the context of the CRC. What would each of you say to a CRC minister or elder who's listening, as like a call to action or an encouragement towards this positive vision of what it means to be Christian Reformed and not just Reformed or not just Christian?
Good question. Call to action. I would say the same thing that I have been telling younger church planters for years, and that is we have an opportunity. I'm not saying the cement is wet for the CRC, but we have an opportunity at the moment to think deeply about the basic philosophy of ministry questions that we have and our basic theological and philosophical presuppositions. And in order to do ministry, like, we need to know why we say yes to things and why we say no to things. And I want us, like, call to action for me would be to think deeply about your philosophy of ministry, your philosophy of worship, and the theological underpinnings for all of them, and then find out if they're coherent. Ask yourself those basic philosophy ministry questions, like, what is a Christian? What are the sacraments? What is the church? Go back to the confessions and the patristic sources and how the church historically has answered those questions, and then find out if that does in fact describe us as the CRC, and if not, what do we need to change If so, what can we celebrate and move forward? Yeah, so I suppose my call to action would be thought, being deliberate and careful, and I suppose prayer. Like I think we do still find ourselves in a season of hurt and pain and difficulty and some instability, and thinking about how we can pray for and with one another are things that I think would be that's the call to action, I suppose, from my vantage point.
Yeah, I guess my call to action would be take a deep breath. um, it's hard to be thoughtful and not be patient. It's hard to kind of just like, it's hard to get a comprehensive view if we're like running full speed at the next controversy. But how, my call would be to slow down a little bit, take in your context and what it actually looks like, kind of what Eric was saying, ask those kind of philosophy of ministry questions. But I think being patient right now and being observant right now as to what is happening, so that in moving forward, we move forward with wisdom and grace, and not just kind of, there's this sense of kind of like this kind of frenetic energy of like, what's the next thing? How are we going to save the denomination? We almost fell off a cliff and we didn't. Now it's it's fight. And I would say that maybe it's time to take a breath, and to take in kind of a wider scope.
I would say that if the CRC is going to survive the tumult of a new era that is defined by internet and social media, we are going to have to work together more. And it seems to me that when I'm in the CRC, I run into people who have affinities with people outside the CRC more than inside. And I think I would argue that if the CRC is going to survive, we are going to need to work together and listen to one another and consider where we are, um, and not just look at the evangelical model and say that's what the CRC needs to be, or not just look at the OPC and say that's what the CRC needs to be. There needs to be a coming together of forging our identity around something that is cohesive. And I think that the place to begin would be our confessions. I think what Eric and Aleah have contributed most to my thinking is that the form and the content need to complement one another, because maybe that can't fit in just any container. But we are going to need to have to come together and listen to one another and to be built up by one another and actually function as a body of Christ together and not be formed by outside sources exclusively. So I guess what that looks like and how we accomplish that, I think that that is worth exploring. But just from even just a functional standpoint, we are not going to do well together if we don't work together and actually listen to one another and forge a future together. That's what I would say.
Well said.
Awesome. Well, thanks you guys for being on the podcast and for contributing such thoughtful conversation. I know it was a wonderful thing to listen to. I didn't contribute much except for the beginning and the end, but that's okay. You guys said so much and I love it. For all those listening, there'll be some links in the show notes about different resources and the articles that we referenced and whatnot. So be sure to check that out. And yeah, thanks, Aleah, Eric, and Aaron, for your thoughts. Goodbye.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Curtis.
Thank you, Chris.